What's going on, Barbell Nation? Dr. Zach Long here from thebarbellphysio.com. Today we're going to talk about some of my favorite fixes for an athlete having difficulty with the overhead squat pattern itself. So one of the biggest things I see as athletes perform the overhead squat is that when the barbell gets overhead, they really lose proper lumbar positioning. So as soon as we get overhead, maybe they start with an overextended spine, and then they go down to squat, and in the bottom they end up rounding out and really going into that butt wink pattern that we hear about a lot. A lot of the times that's because as they go overhead, they don't know how to stabilize overhead, so they default to this overextended lumbar spine pattern, which puts their pelvis in a little bit of an anterior pelvic tilt, which essentially closes off how much total room they have in the hip joint itself to go into deep hip flexion needed to squat down. So as they get towards the bottom of the squat, their pelvis has no choice but to round backwards to open those hips back up, and then the back goes from an overextended position to a flex position under load, which has the potential to put some unnecessary stress on the back, as well as just not having you in optimal positions for optimal performance. So the first thing we need to do is screen out if we're dealing with some shoulder flexion limitations. Because if the athlete doesn't have proper shoulder flexion, then they're going to have to compensate somewhere else downstream. And the most often limitation I see with that is some lat tightness. And the way we're going to test that is by lying on the ground and have the athlete take their arms into flexion with their arm right by their ear and compare it with their legs straight versus their legs flexed. If the athlete has more available range of motion with their legs straight than they do with their legs flexed, then we can blame some of that shoulder limitation on latissimus dorsi, the lats being a little tight. And if that's the case, then they need to spend some time working on some mobility for the lats. If their shoulder mobility is fine, then we know that we probably need to work into some core positioning movements and take them from a progression of exercises that get them holding their core in a more neutral position so that they don't go into those default patterns. We're going to start with using 90-90 breathing as a way to get the athlete to understand a little bit more of a neutral pelvic positioning. Here's how we're going to do it. For 90-90 breathing, I'm laying on my back. I've got my hips and knees flexed to 90 degrees with my feet on the wall. I'm going to pull my hips about 1 inch off the ground, lay down flat. I've got one hand on my stomach, one on my chest. I take a deep breath in through my nose, fill my belly with air before I allow my chest to rise. And then as I exhale through my mouth, I really try to take my rib cage and push my rib cage down. Occasionally with this drill, once an athlete has that movement pattern down, I'll take a band, attach it to a rig, go back into that position, work through that breathing, and add in pulling overhead. That little bit more of a challenge will often expose a little bit more weakness, and that's another intermediate step towards improving the overhead squat. From there, we can go to quadruped rocking. So I'm going to get the athlete positioned so that their feet are at the same stance width that they are when they squat. I'll get on hands and knees. I really have them work through finding what a neutral spine positioning is, and then they're going to rock forward and back, really working on going deeper and deeper into that unloaded squat movement pattern while maintaining a neutral spine. Now, since we're working specifically today on improving neutral spine positioning for the overhead squat, we're going to add in a little arm reach. So as they get down here to this bottom position, we're going to take their arm and we're going to raise it up, aiming to be towards their overhead squat or snatch grip width there. So we're going to rock back, we're going to maintain neutral spine positioning, reach that arm up. And we can repeat that on both sides. Adding in that little bit of arm movement will challenge a lot of athletes and again expose some weaknesses that you might not otherwise see. After they work through quadruped rocking, I really like the face pull overhead squat as a way to get them really activating those upper back muscles, holding the shoulder into elevation, and focusing on a neutral spine positioning. Here's how we're gonna do it. We got a band attached to a rig at about shoulder height, maybe a little bit lower. We're gonna pull our arms back to where my arms are in this 90-90 position, where my elbow's at the same height as my shoulder. Then I'm gonna press overhead to my overhead squat or snatch grip. And then I'm gonna squat. Really working on neutral spine positioning, not letting my spine vary from where it's at in space. That exercise will do a really good job of tying together some of the earlier movements we worked on into a standing squat variation. Once they've done well with that, then we can start working back at putting the barbell overhead and doing weighted overhead squats with better technique.